My name is Attorney Dawn Blagrove. I am the Executive Director of Emancipate NC. Um, and I am here on behalf of Emancipate NC to talk about the reasons why HB 805 are detrimental to our constitutional right to protest, are harmful to our right to vote, and our right to live and be happy. And it's ultimately a bill that is steeped in racism and quieting and quelling the voices of the people. Um, I have with me today Jay Hallen, who is an intern with us this summer, or this summer, yeah, Emancipate NC is an intern with us. He has done incredible work on his own long before he became an intern with us, standing in the streets with the people, fighting, protesting, and also supporting with bail support and legal support for those folks who are arrested. So we're going to talk a little bit this evening about the contextual and the real impacts that 805 can have on the lives of real people. Because very often we talk about these bills and consequences of legislation that is created by our general, sorry y'all, my hair sticking up is driving me crazy. Okay. um and the consequences of laws that are created by our legislators in these very sanitized, distant terms. We want Emancipate NC in this last hour wants to help you understand that these laws have real impacts on people's lives, have real collateral consequences. And no matter what anyone says, is not about property, and maybe it is about property, but really what it's about is telling Black, Brown people, poor people, people who are marginalized, that they should go somewhere, sit down, and shut up. That you do not have a right, no matter what we say, no matter what our Constitution says, that you don't have a right to complain about being treated inhumanely or disrespectfully. You don't have a right to demand changes from your government that are necessary for your communities to feel safe. That's what this bill is really about. And so what we want to do is talk to you a little bit about some of the experiences that we have had protesting, some of the experiences that we have had supporting folks who are in the street protesting, some of the experiences that we have had as it relates to interacting with law enforcement while protesting. And then lastly, the long-term collateral consequences of actually being arrested and exercising your constitutional right to protest, and the long-term consequences that that can have on your life when the criminal justice system is brought into play. So before we get in, I want to just and I'm sure y'all, some of y'all have been here all day, some of you are just joining. So I want to go really quickly over some of the big points of 805 that are especially problematic. And that's hard to do because there's a lot of them. But the first one I want to talk about is rioting and the definition of rioting. As I mentioned earlier, Emancipate NC has been deeply involved in supporting the people in Elizabeth City while they protest and demand changes related to the murder, the state sanctioned murder of Andrew Brown Jr. For those of you who are not aware of that case, Andrew Brown Jr. was shot and killed while seated in his car driving away from his home in the back of his head by Pasquotank sheriffs. The district attorney there, Andrew Womble, made a decision that the officer's actions were justified. And the legal basis for his justification is absurd, but that's a conversation for another day. And since then, since the day that Andrew Brown was murdered by the sheriffs of Pasquotank County, the people of Elizabeth City have been in the streets, protesting, have been in the streets, demanding justice, demanding transparency, and demanding the things that as citizens of Pasquotank County, of North Carolina, and of this country that they have a right to have. They are not asking for things. They are not asking for things from law enforcement or from politically elected folks that are somehow unreasonable or even should even be discretionary. They're asking to see what happened to their friend, this man who was a father, who was a son, who was a nephew, who was an uncle, who was loved. They want to know who murdered him, why they murdered him, and they want some type of consequence for that murder. As of today, they have gotten none. And because of that, they are in the streets protesting and demanding accountability. Because that's really what this is about. It's all about accountability. So the first provision of this bill talks about rioting, and it says that three or more people gathered together in an effort or a space that is deemed by law enforcement to be riotous. Okay, that is enough to constitute a riot. That is enough for law enforcement to deem that there is a riot taking place and that they can act accordingly as though there is a riot taking place. As an example, and what we'll do here is contextualize some of these things. So while in Elizabeth City, we'll be using a lot of Elizabeth City examples this evening because it is so fresh in our minds. But we'll come back to a situation where riot, just the word riot and rioters, can be used and manipulated to create a chilling effect, or more importantly, to create a narrative around peaceful protesting that is violent, that is scary, that is designed to get folks to say it is okay for your constitutional right to protest and constitutional right to speech be trampled on. So we'll come back to that. But the first problem is the definition in and of itself of a riot. The second problem with this bill is the strong penalties that are created for what is deemed to be a riot that involves property damage. The possibility of facing felony charges for exercising your First Amendment right to protest, First Amendment right to free speech, can have untold consequences on individuals, but most importantly, and one of, I think, the underlying issues with this bill, the underlying insidious drivers of this bill, is also about disenfranchisement. Okay, it's also about taking away people's right to vote, because if you charge someone with a felony for something that normally would be a misdemeanor, the chances are that that person, because of lack of resources for legal assistance, or because they just don't know any better, because they have to move on with their lives and can't spend a year or 2 years fighting these charges, may just plead guilty. What happens if a person pleads guilty to a felony in North Carolina? If they end up with probation, then they lose the right to vote while they're on probation. So imagine this, y'all. Imagine that the hundreds of people that were arrested in Raleigh last summer for doing virtually nothing except for exercising their constitutional right to protest. Those people who believe firmly that we need new legislators, we need new elected officials, and we need new people running our criminal justice system. Now, you imagine that all of those people who were arrested were charged with felonies and given probationary sentences. None of them would be eligible to vote in the 2022 election, or for as long as that probation lasts. Make no mistake, this is not just about it. This bill is insidious on multiple levels. And the collateral consequences that come out of creating felony charges that are so vague and so discretionary for law enforcement have also the benefit of disenfranchising large parts of marginalized communities that are already marginalized, where our vote is already watered down because of the disproportionate impact that Black communities have with law enforcement in the first place, right? So if it hasn't already been discussed, I want you all to think about this bill, not just as an anti-protest bill, but also as a voter disenfranchisement bill, because that's really what it is. The last thing that I want to talk about, big picture, is the provision in this bill that calls for civil liability to an individual that is charged with creating property damage. And what the bill says right now is that that person can be charged with 3 times the cost of the property damage that they are being accused of creating, plus court fines and lawyers' fees. Now, I need you all to understand the absurdity of a provision like that. When we live in a state where law enforcement officers have qualified immunity, so when they, so here's how this could work, just in practice. I go out and protest in Elizabeth City because the murderers who killed Andrew Brown Jr. with state approval, because they are facing no consequences for their action, not criminally or civilly. I go out to protest my disdain for the lack of respect for the life of Andrew Brown. I get arrested for exercising my right to protest. At some point, there is some property damage, whatever that property damage may be. So not only do I face criminal charges, I also face the possibility of being burdened with thousands of dollars in debt to a business owner, simply because I was exercising my right to protest, simply because I was outraged because no Pasquotank County sheriff was being held accountable for murdering a human being. That, my friends, is the epitome of absurdity. It is insane. And that is one of the many, many reasons why this bill has got to be stopped. So at this point, I think is Kerwin on? I thought I saw him. Kerwin Pittman is here with us. He's gonna join with us in a few minutes. But right now, I want to turn the virtual podium over to Jay, who's going to talk to you a little bit about his experiences in Elizabeth City and everywhere where he has protested, and some of the more egregious things that he has seen, where law enforcement officers use the incredible amount of discretion that they have to create violent crimes where violent crimes don't exist. Jay?
Thank you for that, Don. I mean, you talked about the bill better than I ever could have. This is a direct attack on the citizens of North Carolina, specifically the Black and Brown citizens of North Carolina, their right to vote, their right to assemble, and their right to protest freely. So before I jump into that discussion of the other just ridiculousness of what a lot of the law enforcement agents like to do in North Carolina and more broadly, I also want to pull attention towards one specific phrase within the bill and how it can be especially disastrous, which is the term willfully engages, something that you see a lot in the text of this bill, especially when it relates to some of the new felony charges that are put up. It says if a person willfully engages in a riot, then they're getting a Class F felony. When you first read that, you might think, oh, willfully engages, that means I have to throw a brick. I have to do something of that regard. Whereas in reality, it means a lot less than that. It basically just means that when a law enforcement officer says, hey, you have to disperse, if you choose not to disperse, if you choose to continue your constitutionally protected right to free speech, that is evidence that you are choosing to, in their words, in the state's words, willfully engage. So all you have to do to be charged with a felony under this new potential statute, under this bill, is to continue protesting, to continue your free speech rights after and a random law enforcement officer on the scene tells you that you have to go home. And that kind of brings me into my discussion of the atrocities we see a lot of these law enforcement officers commit on the ground in Elizabeth City, in Raleigh, in Durham, all over North Carolina, and all over the US as a whole. A lot of my experiences over the summer I can't necessarily talk about in too much detail due to the fact that I was generally a legal observer on the ground. But one thing I can talk about is the way that I've seen a lot of law enforcement officers, in situations where I was on the ground protesting, using this sort of dispersal language as an opportunity or as a tool to break apart completely lawful, completely legal protests. Generally, what will happen is that the law enforcement officers will follow at a distance. And as soon as they see something that they don't like, even if it's in reality nothing to do with a riotous situation, even if there's no violence, or even if there is, they'll immediately bring out that dispersal language. They'll start calling for a dispersal, and as soon as folks continue marching, as is their constitutionally protected right to, they'll swarm in and start pulling in folks to arrest. These arrest charges, they can have a huge impact on people's lives. If you're charged with failure to disperse, if you're charged with assault on a government official, which sometimes can mean something as simple as, flailing your arms a little bit while the police are picking you up and throwing you on the ground in a violent manner, that can ruin your life. I have friends who have been fired following, just charges being put up against them, not even, going through the court system yet, just purely the arrest against them. I've had friends that have had bonds severed with family, who have had all sorts of negative interactions just simply because they were out protesting. The police decided that they didn't like what they were doing, called a dispersal order, and started arresting folks in a violent manner. Um, I can definitely talk more depending on what Don is feeling about um, other situations that are similar to this, about curfew situations, about all of the problems with Article 36A more broadly and this bill specifically. But yeah, I'll turn it back over to Don and potentially to introduce Kerwin.
Thanks, Jay, for grounding us in that lived experience. And really, that's what we wanted. That's what Emancipate NC wants to discuss, because the we have the privilege of serving the people on the ground, in the courtroom, and from start to finish of these types of interactions. So we are very up close and personal with folks, and we are there when the cameras go away, when the sexiness of protesting is done, and what you're left with are criminal charges that linger on for years, or you're left with the consequences of being bruised and battered because law enforcement has deployed munitions on you, non-lethal munitions on you. Emancipate NC tries to stand in that gap. So I thank Jay for putting some context around what it looks like on the street and how law enforcement officers really abuse their discretion. Now, I want to give you all a very quick personal story. So I was myself arrested for the first time in Elizabeth City while trying to help protect the constitutional rights of folks in Elizabeth City who are on the ground protesting and demanding transparency and fairness and equity. uh, I was in my car, sitting in my car, attempting to drive away. And really, what I was going to do was, because we assist with the bail fund. And as an attorney myself, I help with Muffin and Christy and Kerwin are folks that I'm on the ground with in very real ways all the time. Well, as of late, anyways. And Elizabeth City, though, was the first time for me that I was really, really in the thick of things. In the thick of things when police violence started, in the thick of things when under the cloak of darkness, when things get ugly. And here's what I want everyone on this call to understand and remember, if you don't remember anything else. I have never seen a situation where it is not the police that incite violence. I'm going to say that again. I have never seen a situation where it is not the police that incite ensuing violence. Always. That being said, when the people respond in a way that is violent in the face of violence, the people are demonized instead of the law enforcement officers, agencies, and this corrupt system that allows for a sheriff of Pasquotank County to shoot a man in the back of his head and not be held responsible at all. Instead of that violence being the violence that is focused on, it is the reactionary violence that we're talking about. And honestly, it is violent. Violent is a definition of a word. Violence is what it is. But violence in and of itself is a neutral thing. Violence by people in the streets who are protesting, who are furious, like Dr. King said, that is the language of the unheard. That is the language of the ignored. That is the language of the marginalized. So for the violence of the people who cannot be heard any other way to be so heavily criminalized, so heavily impactful, focused on so heavily, means that our elected officials and those people in our criminal justice system and our law enforcement agencies across this country still don't get the problem. Because the problem is not the people. The problem is never the people. In Elizabeth City, when I was arrested, where I was arrested in Elizabeth City, there was not one iota of property damage. None. These folks have been protesting for months, peacefully. Yet still, 35 of them have been arrested. If 805 was in place, many of those folks would be facing serious felony charges. Because the charging is at the discretion of law enforcement. What they say goes. Even when in our case, you have an attorney, myself, before the magistrate who is able to argue strongly against the characterization that law enforcement has created about what actually happened and why these individuals were arrested, it is always the word of law enforcement that prevails. So when we think about these types of laws, and we think about them in a very sanitized way, what we have to learn to do is to train ourselves to think about the implications of these types of laws in real world settings. In real world settings, there is no balance of power between the arrestee and law enforcement. In real settings, the discretion that law enforcement officers have is virtually absolute. That means that unless you have an agency of law enforcement officers who are committed to transparency, truth, and fairness, which unfortunately we have not seen in America anywhere ever, then you are creating a situation where marginalized people are put in further harm, where poor people are put in situations where they will ultimately end up more destitute, where people who feel they have no voice will be silenced indefinitely. This bill is bad for so many reasons, but I'm going to jump down to Kerwin and let him talk to you a little bit more about what his experiences are on the streets protesting and help you contextualize what it looks like when law enforcement officers create, and you see this on the news and the narratives that they create, and they talk about riots. I want Kerwin to talk to you all a little bit about what it looks like, what it feels like when you're in the streets, as opposed to the narrative that is created by law enforcement, the narrative that is created sometimes by the media, the narrative that is created by those folks in power to make you think that the people who should be punished are those folks who are asking for their humanity to be recognized. Thanks, Kerwin.
No problem. Beautifully put. It's an honor to be on this call to really share my experience from being on the ground and what this particular bill would do to individuals like myself and a host of my other comrades who will be targeted. Like we was targeted in Elizabeth City. So for those who don't know, I was arrested in Elizabeth City while I was actually on my way to bail people out and assist with the bailing of people out. So I was charged with failure to disperse, even though I was leaving the area, even though I got on the scene after dispersive orders was given, and even though I was walking by myself and wasn't even with a crowd to disperse from. And so it is bills like this that would give officers discretion to really charge individuals with felonies and be saddled with a felony. And we know once you get into their criminal justice system, whose side and who word they're going to take. They're going to paint me out to be as a total anarchist who's trying to destroy the government and burn down buildings instead of somebody who's really out here in the streets fighting for justice and trying to organize and mobilize the people to stand up for themselves and show them how to stand up for themselves. But yet, when you see counter protesters like in Pittsburgh, like in Graham, like we seen in Elizabeth City. We seen particularly how law enforcement treat these individuals. And I'm gonna be honest, majority of these individuals are white, if not all. In every instance, guess what? They do something crazy, they walk away free. Majority of the initiators of different things that happen at protests, guess what? They're white. And this is a protest to protest the injustice that's going on that somebody killed, particularly black or brown populations, right? But guess who they snatch up? The black people, particularly the organizers. And so these are the people that they're going to come after. And really, this is what this bill is saying. This bill is saying we don't want you to organize. Negroes, we want you to stay in your place. And if you try to rise up out of your place, Negro, we're going to put something on the books to make sure we deter you. And if we don't deter you, we're going to make an example out of you and we're going to strike you down. So if a bill like this is passed, you can rest assured that it will be more bills coming down the pipeline. There will be more, even more damaging to people who try to organize, to people who try to stand up against injustice, to people who want the truth. They're going to try to come down. And that's why it is extremely important that we really lean on these different actors within the General Assembly to make sure, that this is not passed, to make sure that they are held accountable if they do vote yes, because it ain't no mistake. I don't want to hear we made a mistake, we hit the wrong button. I ain't trying to hear it. Because when the police make that decision to charge me with a felony and I'm out here in the streets, it ain't gonna be no mistake. It ain't gonna be no mistake. And my life is on the line. And your life is on the line. And your kids' life is on the line. And this is what we're doing this for. That's why it is extremely important. It is extremely important to get in these fights. It is extremely important to stand and hold these different people in the General Assembly accountable. But most importantly, when crap like HB 805 come up, to shout out against it, to speak out against it, and stand up against it. Because I've seen firsthand what they're gonna do to me, and I know what they're gonna do to me if laws like this are put on the books. And you can rest assured it might be your kids that's out there in the street next. Because there's no telling how long this will linger around once it's on those books, right? So who's to say who gonna have the gumption to strike it off the books, to take it down once it's up there? You know it's gonna linger up there. You know it's gonna linger up there. So I'm saying this, right? With my experience in North Carolina, with demonstrating, with organizing, with being on the ground, right? Uh, a bill like this is specifically targeted to deter our people, point blank, plain and simple. And if you stand for that, then you're standing really on the wrong side of justice. You really are. You're standing on the wrong side of history. You really are. And silent means acceptance. So if you are silent about this, guess what? You accept it. So I'm gonna take it as you saying yes. You voting yes to it. That's how I'm gonna take it. Everybody should be in an uproar about this. Everybody should be concerned about this. You don't got to be on the front lines to be concerned about this bill. This bill affects everybody. Particularly, they're gonna start at the heart of it, the people that's out there on the ground, and strike fear in these individuals. And so, from my experience, seeing bills like this, I know that it's just strictly to target our people and to keep the Negro in their place. And we know who introduced it, and we know what their mindset is. And so, if you got to take this opportunity, in all honesty, to really say, we're not taking it. We're not gonna take it at all, and we're gonna do what we gotta do to make sure that it don't go through. And if it do, we're gonna hold you accountable. And we ain't trying to hear no excuses, and we ain't trying to hear I made no mistake, I hit the wrong button. I'm sorry I hadn't ate lunch, my sugar was low. I ain't trying to hear none of that. Because when the police come get me and charge me with a felony, which they're gonna try to do, organizers they're gonna try to come at. I ain't gonna try to hear none of those excuses. And I'm gonna have no mercy, and I promise you, you should have no mercy because your kids, kids, life is on the line. Do you want them to be saddled with a felony for this? And I just told y'all how they targeted me. Failure to disperse, that would have been, they could have charged me with a felony if this would have went through. And I wasn't even around nobody. I didn't even hear no dispersal orders. I wasn't even in the crowd. I was going to bail people out. And it's that simple. And this is the type of injustice that happened on the ground. But guess what? When David and James are on the other side, the counter protesters, they're not targeting them. And they're throwing up all type of white supremacist signs. I've seen it firsthand. I've been there. But guess who they look at and target? Me. And people who look like me. And people who look like your people, 9 times out of 10. So I'm just saying, y'all got a chance right now to really stand in your power and really say, yo, I'm gonna hold you accountable. If you do vote, I ain't trying to hear your sugar was low. I ain't trying to hear none of that. So if you're gonna play it like that, then we're gonna get you up out there. We're gonna organize against you. And I don't care which side of the aisle you on. It don't matter to me. It
That's
do
right.
not matter to me because my loyalty is to the people. That
That's
is
right.
it. So if you're in those
That's right.
positions, then you need to stand with the people or you need to stand down. And those are my experiences. So HB 805, it gotta go.
Thank you so much, Kerwin, for always keeping it real with us and bringing your real, true life experience. And hear me when I tell y'all, folks, Kerwin is a true soldier. He is a soldier for constitutionality. He is a soldier for the people. He is a soldier for what is right and what is just and what is fair. Okay. And for many of us who are on these panels, everybody can't be a soldier. Let me tell you something. Everybody ain't built for it. Because I'm going to tell you the truth, y'all. I was out there in them streets in Elizabeth City, and that thing is different. It is different when you out there. It is different when the police snatch your behind up and put you in handcuffs. That's a different level. It is a different level of commitment to protecting not just your own rights, but the rights of everyone. So if you are not a foot soldier, and everybody can't be, okay? And that's all right. There's nothing wrong with that. But then it is more imperative that you play your role in ensuring that the foot soldiers who are out there fighting and putting their physical persons, their livelihoods, their bodies on the lines to protect your constitutional rights, that you are doing everything you can from your home with your phones, calling your legislators to ensure that those people who are doing the fighting on the front lines are protected. You may not be a frontline fighter, and again, that is okay. But if you allow this bill to pass, if you do nothing, if you stay silent because you think that this bill doesn't impact you, then like Kerwin said, you are on the wrong side. And there are many of you, and I'm talking directly to you, who have positions of power, who have positions of privilege, who are comfortable, who got good government jobs, right? And you can't afford to be out in these streets, right? With the children. But that doesn't mean you get a pass on supporting them. That doesn't mean that you get a pass on not making sure that they are protected, and that you get a pass on not using your power to ensure that those kids on the street, that those people on the street that are fighting for you directly, you have responsibility to ensure that they are safe, just like they put their bodies and lives on the line to ensure that you have a right to be safe, to ensure that your children make it home safely at night, to ensure that law enforcement are held accountable, to ensure that it is not your husband who is shot in the back of the head and no one is held accountable because he is shot by state actors. It is all of our responsibility to play our role in liberation. And make no mistake, this is a process of liberation. We have seen all over where Juneteenth has been made a national federal holiday, and we have celebrated that. But make no mistake, Black folks are still not free in America. We are still fighting for freedom. And if you are not fighting with us, however you are able to fight, then you are fighting against us. And that may feel harsh and that may sound mean, but it is the truth. And it is the truth that we all have to stand in. It is the uncomfortable truth that we all have to stand in. Because there are people right now, 35 or so people who are arrested in Elizabeth City, who are facing criminal charges. I myself reached out to try to see if we could resolve some of these issues without the need for litigation, without the need for moving forward. And unequivocally, the response that we received was that the district attorney's office in Pasquotank County was not interested in settling these cases. Very often, these folks are charged incorrectly, but more importantly, they are being accused of things they simply did not do. For example, and I'll just speak to myself, when I was arrested that night, my charges were not certified, but I was arrested for being in violation of curfew. Now, there was an exception to that curfew rule, which was if you were working. I was able to successfully, with myself and Christy Puckett Williams, we sat there together to successfully argue that we were in fact working, that our jobs are to protect the constitutional rights of the people and to ensure that those folks who are on the front line are safe and have advocates. Understand the law, understand what they can do, understand what they cannot do, and assist them navigate. We were working. The Black magistrate who we were in front of understood that, respected that, and acknowledged that we had been wrongfully arrested and let us go. Now, fast forward a couple of nights later, when Christy and Kerwin were arrested, still me, still the same attorney, still arguing ferociously on behalf of my clients to have these ridiculous charges dismissed against them. And I couldn't get those charges dismissed. Why? Because they weren't going to let this Black girl do that twice, right? And I'll say that to you all not as speculation or conjecture, because after I left, at one point when I left the room with one of my clients was still in the room, the magistrate, not realizing the relationship that existed between myself and my client, said to my client, she's right. These charges are bad. But she still certified them. She still certified them. What that means is that there are folks, some who live in Elizabeth City, some who don't, who will be traveling back and forth to Elizabeth City for court hearings for the next year to 2 years, simply because they are unwilling to cede their constitutional right to protest. And that is an act of bravery, but it is also an act of selflessness, because they do it not just for us and not just for themselves, but they also do it for you. So in this moment, we are asking you to call every senator, call your locally elected senator, call those who you didn't elect. Call every senator you can and tell them that if they do not vote against HB 805, they will not get your financial support. They will not get your vote. You will not invite them to speak at your PTA meetings. You will shun them publicly and privately. This is where your fight comes in. You may not be able to put your physical body on the line, but you can use your privilege and your power to stop this piece of bad legislation so that those people who do put their physical bodies their reputations, their right to vote on the line for you are protected. This is where the rubber meets the road. If you consider yourself to be a liberal, now is the time. Now is the time to stand up for what is right. Be on the right side of history, value people more than property, but more importantly, send a strong message that every American citizen, no matter what color you are, has a right to expect that our government will treat us humanely, that our government will treat us fairly, that our government will treat us with transparency, and where the state has wronged us, our government will ensure that those wrong actors are properly punished. Now is the time for you to use your voice and your power to protect those folks who are on the front lines for you every single day. So, thank you so much for those of you who have been here from the very beginning. Thank you so much for being here, for listening. For those of you who joined later, please understand the most important thing is for you to tell your friends, your neighbors, your family members, your church congregants, your co-workers, that they need to call legislators, they need to go to the General Assembly, and they need to make it be known loudly and proudly that they will not stand for the unjust treatment of people who are putting their lives on the lines every single day to protect your constitutional rights. And that does it for our segment. Thank you so much for listening to us. Thank you so much for allowing us to share our lived experiences with you. And thank you so much for allowing us to contextualize this very, very insidious bill.